I'm Fiona Hill, the Director of the Centre on the United States and Europe here at the Brookings Institution. And I'd really like to thank all of you for joining us today for a discussion of what is a very important, but obviously also controversial and very sensitive topic. Before introducing the panel, I want to stress that this is an event that's initiated by me and my colleagues. I'm here today from the Centre on the United States and Europe. Can people hear? Sorry, I heard a noise there. Somebody, can everybody hear okay, yes? Okay, so I'll just, I thought for a moment that only I could hear myself and everybody else couldn't hear me, which, typical British person, keep on talking, irrespective of whether people can hear you or not. Anyway, as I was saying, before introducing the panels, I wanted to stress that the event today is initiated by me and a group of my colleagues here at the Centre on the United States and Europe, along with colleagues from the Carnegie Endowment and MIT Centre for International Studies. Now, the fact that we are holding this conference here in this auditorium is in no way indicative of any institutional position on the part of the Brookings Institution or indeed on the part of the other organisations. The views of Brookings scholars expressed today are their own, and they should not be attributed to the Brookings Institution or its officers, because the Brookings Institution does not take positions on any policy issue. So the purpose of this conference is to highlight and discuss this topic and its sensitivities, and to offer some perspectives, obviously not all perspectives. We do not intend to thrash out all of the various positions, nor are we here to make any legal or political pronouncements, which we're not empowered in any case to make. So our aim, like all of the research conducted at Brookings, and like all of the other events that we host here, is to inform the public debate, not to advance a political agenda. Having said all of that, we are here, however, to try to understand how the debate about the Armenian genocide has evolved over the years since World War I, from the context of World War I 100 years ago to today in 2015. And today in 2015, we're all bearing witness to other atrocities in the Middle East. In some of the successor states of the Ottoman Empire, we see political upheavals and wars in the territory that covers modern Syria, Iraq and the Levant, that have led to renewed persecution and forced displacement of minority groups, who've all been targeted on the basis of ethnicity and religion. So today's events in the Middle East are creating new trauma and cycles of collective grievance and recrimination. And this is actually where we're leading up to today in all of the panels. It's the focus of the final panel of the conference, and I hope that you will stay on for this. I know it's very difficult when you have a very long conference with 3 events and people have jobs, but I do hope that you will bear with us to the end of today's events. We're also, most importantly, here in the spirit of reconciliation. Most of us here today have been working closely with the Hrant Dink Foundation on Turkish-Armenian reconciliation. Many of us knew Hrant Dink personally, and he's been a great inspiration for this and for other events. Now, for those of you in the audience who don't know or did not know Hrant Dink, he was a Turkish journalist and civil society activist of Armenian descent who was devoted to the cause of reconciliation between Armenians and Turks, and who sacrificed his life for the freedom of speech. He was assassinated on January 19, 2007. Hrant Dink believed that history should not be legislated, and that Turks should come to terms with their own past through their own open and frank discussion of the most painful issue at hand. Hrant Dink also, very importantly, acknowledged the broader context of World War I and the fact that Turks and Muslims also suffered during the carnage of war and the brutal chaos of the disintegration of a huge multi-ethnic and multi-confessional empire. Hrant Dink once said to his fellow Turkish citizens, "Come, let us first understand each other. Come, let us first respect each other's pain. Come, let us first let one another live." Some of us were at a conference, a very groundbreaking conference, held by the Hrant Dink Foundation in November of last year, November 2014 in Turkey. It was on the issue of reconciliation and the prospects for normalization of Turkish-Armenian relations. Significantly, the conference was hosted by Ankara University and the School of Political Studies, with many Turkish officials present. So this event, in some respects, is a follow-on to that meeting. And the Friends of Hrant Dink organization and MIT have helped to bring some of the out-of-town speakers that we have today to Washington, D.C. to participate in this and also some of the seminars. So we're here today in the spirit of Hrant Dink's words and in honor of Hrant Dink's memory, and that's why we've convened this conference. So I also hope that those of you who are here today with us who have different views on how this topic should have been handled will give our speakers a chance to offer their perspectives and will also engage with us in an open and frank and civil discussion worthy of the democratic values that Hrant Dink embraced. We're going to begin the conference with a panel on the context of World War I and the events of 1915, chaired by Tom DeVal of Carnegie Endowment, who is the author of a newly released book, Great Catastrophe. Unfortunately, we didn't have flies for the book today, but I hope that some of you have seen this and will think about buying it. There's my plug for Tom. We have to keep our colleagues in good order with their book sales. But this book is a very important discussion of all of the different aspects and dimensions of today's topic. The panel also features 3 leading historians, Tana Akçim, Lena Ekmekçoğlu, and David Gaunt. And although there was widespread suffering during World War I, as we will discuss today on the panel, the catastrophe that befell the Armenian Ottoman communities can't be just contextualized away as collateral damage amid the chaos of this terrible war. The second panel, which will follow this one, will be chaired by my Brookings colleague Kemal Kirishi, and it will focus on how the events and atrocities of 1915 have shaped modern Turkish-Armenian relations, and how they've also played a role in other conflicts in the Caucasus. Tom DeVal will be a speaker on this panel, along with Gera Liberidian, who was the former senior advisor to the President of Armenia, as well as a long-standing historian of regional issues, and 2 experts from Turkey, Mithat Çelikpala and Nigar Göksel, who have followed regional conflicts closely for decades. Finally, as I already noted, our third panel will look at the present day. It'll look at the difficulties of reconciliation, as well as the current context in the Middle East. This panel is chaired by our colleague Lily Gardner-Feldman from Johns Hopkins University, and she and another speaker, Catherine Guizin, both work on themes of reconciliation in a broader European and international context. They'll be joined by Ömer Taşpınar, a non-resident colleague here at Brookings, as well as a professor at the National Defense University, and Arman Grigorian from Lehigh University. And we'll also have Hisham Melem, who is the bureau chief of Al Arabiya, on the panel, who will offer us a view from the contemporary Middle East. Now, bios for all of the chairs and panelists are in the handouts for the conference. And there's actually a mystery person in the bios, which just goes to show that you can never be sure what's going on here. David Hirschman, who is not with us and is not one of the panelists, but seems to have been an interloper from a previous event, who is accidentally in the bio. So if all of you are wondering, why is the CEO of the US Chamber of Commerce here? He's not. And we just noticed this when you were looking at this. We also had previously got the name of our own centre wrong. So if you find any mistakes in any of these materials, these are just accidents and artifacts of our own editing process, and not the fact that some sneaky person has made their way into this event. Poor David Hirschman, I'm sure he's now wondering why he has been associated with our event, so please don't anybody email him and ask him why he wasn't here or why he should have been here. He's an accident. Anyway, thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to hand over to Tom to frame the opening panel. Our speakers, as most of them are academics, are much more used to speaking from lecterns. So they're going to come up here to speak, and then they will sit down and be mic'd for the Q&A. So please bear with us while we do shift around. I do hope that nobody falls from the stage, as I'm trying to not do when I get off. So that only happens to Madonna in concerts, but hopefully not to Tom DeVal and our colleagues. Thank you again to all of you for joining us today. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. As Fiona said, I'm Tom DeVal from the Carnegie Endowment. It's great to be here, and I think we should all thank many institutions, Hrant Dink Foundation, MIT, and Brookings for the great work they put into organizing this conference. I think there have been many events on the centenary, but this will be, I promise you, this will be the best. I'm in my personal capacity as a scholar of the Caucasus, I'm also, and on behalf of the Carnegie Endowment, we're also co-sponsoring this event. I should say that a few years ago, the idea that in Washington, the idea that Carnegie and Brookings would be co-sponsoring an event would be almost as unthinkable as Armenians and Turks reconciling. So there's some progress there as well, I'm very glad to say. We've got 3 historians here, and I think this event today is really all about the intersection of history and politics. And as we're talking books, I should also briefly plug their books. Taner Akşam is the author of many books on the Armenian genocide. Most recently, The Young Turks' Crime Against Humanity, The Armenian Genocide and Ethnic Cleansing in the Ottoman Empire. Lena Ekmekgioğlu is author of a forthcoming book, that's correct, with Princeton, called Recovering Armenia, Limits of Belonging in Post-Genocide Turkey. And David Gaunt, to our right, who's Professor of History at Södertörn University in Stockholm, is, I think, world-renowned expert on the fate of the Assyrians in World War I, and is the author of Massacres, Resistance, Protectors, Muslim-Christian Relations in Southeast Anatolia during World War I. I think it's important to say that the historians have moved the understanding, the debate about what happened in 1915 way beyond the politicians. I think the politicians, I would say, are still struggling, and the media are still struggling to catch up. The last 10 or 15 years has produced some excellent history, and we're no longer, as 10 or 15 years ago, people would have been exercised in very kind of legalistic debates about did what happened in 1915 fit the definition of genocide. I see the media is still trying to answer those sort of questions, but the historians have moved a long way beyond that, I would say, in their sophistication, in their analysis. I think I'm correct in saying all four of us use the word Armenian genocide as an analytic term, but are less interested in the kind of legalistic, politicized aspects of the use of that word. So it's going to be great to have three historians to discuss, look back, and bring all their sophisticated analysis to the first topic. So without further ado, let's hand over to Taner Akşam. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I thank you for the invitation, and there are a lot of organizations involved. I thank all of them all together. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. What I'm going to do here, try to give a macro perspective to understand the Armenian genocide. I have a new argument for you. This is maybe where I ended up after 30 years research on Armenian genocide. Armenian genocide has been debated for the most part as a phenomenon that occurred between the years of 1915-18. Naturally, the historical roots were discussed, and there were different explanations for the causes, but at the end, the point of the discussion was to understand what had occurred between 1915 and 18. In other words, the genocide was taken up and debated as an event, and an occurrence that took place between 1915 and 18. What I want to do here is something different. I propose that we use the concept of genocide not to describe an event that took between 1915 and 18, but as a process that started in 1878 and in one respect was concluded by 1923 by Lausanne Agreement. Genocide not as an occurrence, but as a process. The theoretical background goes to Lemkin, historian Lemkin. Maybe in question and answer period, we can discuss more on that aspect. No doubt dates have symbolic significance, and that can be pulled in either directions. I want to use the 1878 Treaty of Berlin as the start date because of the Article 61, and the Armenian problem became an undeniable piece of international diplomacy, and from that day forward, the great powers were not only active players, they were part of the problem, and they were also the one who determined which direction it took. Another significance of 1878, for my purpose, is that from that year onward, the issue started to be called Armenian reform question. Please write it down, Armenian reform question. This description provides us with the main characteristic of the period and the problem, Armenian problem as a reform, as a question of reform. So what I'm suggesting here is a very simple idea. the Armenian problem should be understood and debated as a matter of reforms that covered the period from 1878 to 1923. This period could be described within 3 different frameworks that are correlated with each other. These 3 separate context frameworks corresponded to the 3 different sides of Armenian reform question. First context is that the Armenian genocide is not a standalone event that involved the Armenians alone. It must be treated as one part of the policies that were implemented towards other Christian communities, both before and after 1878 by the Ottoman government. After 1878, the Macedonian crisis of the early 20th century, the ethnic cleansing of the Greeks' Rum population of the Thrace and Aegean region following the Balkan War of 1912, the Assyrian genocide during the First World War, the genocide of Pontus Greeks of the Black Sea during 1921-22, the burning of Smyrna, Izmir in 1922, and the 1924 Turkish-Greek population exchange are among the most well-known events of this era. If the Armenian genocide is taken up as one part of the policies implemented against the Christian population, it becomes comprehensible. It would be appropriate to define the period between 1878 and 1923 as the period of Ottoman genocide. This is the term that we started using in our research, to which the Armenian genocide constitutes only one part of it. Within this context, the demographic policies implemented during the years 1913 and 18 played an instrumental role. What was driving these policies was an attempt to rescue the empire rather than to establish a Turkish nation state. The empire was on the verge of the collapse and falling apart, and by homogenizing around a collective identity called Turkish Islamic synthesis, the empire was to be saved or tried to be saved by Committee of Union and Progress Party. They want to prevent the dismemberment of the empire. I think this is an interesting theory for you, not that the CUP targeted not to establish a nation state, but their policy was within the empire context, it can be understood. So then within that policy, the 2 fundamental pillars was of this homogenization, the cultural Turkishness that still maintained a connection with Islam and a Sunni interpretation of it. And for that reason, homogenization aimed not only the removal of Christians through forced expulsion and annihilation, but also the deportation and assimilation of non-Turkish Muslims. During the 1913-18 period, Bosnians, Arabs, Kurds, and Circassian other non-Turkish Muslim population were also relocated and settled in different places, and the term assimilation was used by Ottoman authorities themselves. This is not the term that I'm making up. Their purpose was to assimilate these small other ethnic groups, non-Turkish Muslims, within Turkish majority. This is the policy that they implemented. And as a result of this demographic policy of 1913-18, the ethnic makeup of Anatolia has been completely changed. The estimate 17 million people of Anatolia were so uprooted that by the end of the period, at least 1/3 of this population had been resettled elsewhere, deported, or annihilated. The establishment of modern Turkey was possible as a result of these demographic policies implemented during First World War years. Second context pertains to the massacre directly targeted the Armenians. Without wanting to ignore the massacres that occurred elsewhere, like Sassoon 1904-5, you may never heard about it, and Marash 1921, this period, 3 huge massacres occurred during 1878-1923. One is the what we call it Abdülhamit massacres, 1894-96. Approximately 200,000 Armenians were massacred, and the Adana massacre of 1909, approximately 20,000 Armenians were massacred, and the genocide of 1915-18, approximately 1 million Armenians were massacred during that period. And up until now, these three large massacres were examined independently of each other as unique singular phenomena. No one had tried to interpret these three events by looking through the same window. This is what I'm going to do here for you. Of course, there have been some very good attempts at explanation which have described both 1894, 96, and 1909 massacres as preparation, rehearsal for or precursor of the genocide of 1915-18. In the early genocide literature, these events, 1894 or Adana 1909, was considered as rehearsal for the Armenian genocide. In these studies, however, the one thing that connected all three massacres was an abstract actor or agent, the Turk, and some characteristic that we attributed to them as the causes of the massacres. These characteristics were searched within culture, ideology, or mentality. So I'm quoting some quotes from the authors. The quotes doesn't belong to me. In this approach, such concept, a subculture of massacre, or the Ottoman Turkish propensity to resolve acute conflict by resorting to violence. These are quotes. Or as well as statement like, quote, Islamic doctrines and traditions embodied an inherent resistance to change. So occupied these ideas in important role, putting in a simplistic way the religion of Islam, the prevalence of militaristic culture among the Turks, or expansionist ideologies like Pan-Turanism and Pan-Islamism were put forth as root causes of the genocide. I'm ready to accept these types of method of explanation, which can be called essentialist actually in nature, can provide us with some important clues that might help us to understand the behavior of just one of the actors in the process, main perpetrator group. However, I would like to state that these studies that describe the period by putting the intention and the motivation of one actor who performs the act, it's called ahistorical. It is not really a historical analysis of the period. What I'm proposing is an explanation of these three massacres which doesn't rely on only the intention of motivation of a single actor, namely the Turks, but rather that one puts the Armenian reform question front and center, connects all these massacres together, and includes two other actors in the process, in addition to the Ottoman rulers, Armenian reform movements, different branches of it, and the great powers. So they too were active in this process. We would need to adhere, of course, the dynamic relations on the locals, Circassians, Kurds, and so on, in order to extend the scope. But all these three massacres, 1894, 1909, and 1915-18, came about as a result of the common denominator of the dynamic relations of these actors. Throughout the entire process, the one thing that distinguished the relation between the actors was their different position that they took on the Armenian reform question. Despite certain differences in ideological preferences or social class roots, the massacre occurred as the common response of Ottoman Turkish rulers, both sultans and the CUP party leaders. So, and one additional important issue I don't have time to discuss, but the Armenian reform movement were not passive receiver in that process. They were also active participant in that process, and this gives it a dynamic process. The critical case here is the Adana massacre of 1909, and whether or not really we should put the Adana massacre within that context. There are debates and discussion, but my argument is we have to put Adana as a bridge between 1894, 96, and 1915, and this is the continuity on the reform question. Why Adana is so important on the reform question? Maybe this is a revelation for the historians. Nobody knew until recently that there were indeed another reform package in Ottoman Parliament, 1909, before Adana massacre. So this is an interesting other topic that must be discussed. So the third context, this is to unite all these three big massacres on the axis of Armenian reform question is something that has to be done and researched truly. The third context interprets the Armenian genocide as part of the history of collapse of the four large empires of Europe. By this process, which started in the mid of 19th century, which came to head in 1918, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman Empire collapsed. The struggle for nation-states within each of these empires, fed by French Revolution, played an important role in this collapse. Each of these empires tried to suppress the nationalist movement within their own territories, nevertheless fanned the flames of the similar movement in rival empires. And the nationalist movement in each empire turned into the direct subject of power struggle between different empires. Among these empires, the Ottomans ended up being the most vulnerable and were exposed and defenseless to foreign meddling due to their weakness. The large-scale power struggles between empires devastated the equilibrium of the Ottomans. The most visible reason behind the meddling was to ameliorate the conditions of the Ottoman Christians. The most common expression that was used during the frequent meetings, I'm quoting from the diplomatic reports, quote, to give security and content to the Christians by obtaining for them a fair share in the Ottoman administration, end quote. This is from the diplomatic reports that they used. It was because of the Islamic institutional makeup of the state, as well as the effect of the Islamic culture, whereby Muslims did not see Christians as equal to themselves, the Ottomans could not formulate a way to bring Christians into equal status with Muslims. The actual framework that determined the foreign intervention was less about humanitarian concern and more about calculated based upon realpolitik by the great powers. And I have a new theory here also, not the theory, but new approach. They viewed, the European great powers, viewed the problems of Ottoman state with its Christian as a part of European security. This is, again, if you read the diplomatic correspondence very carefully, you will see that they considered Ottomans' problems with Christians as a part of European security. So they believed if the Ottomans did not find a solution to their problems with its Christians, it could turn into an internal conflict within Europe in short order. Security concerns in Europe were one of the biggest justifications for intervention. What happened was, and with the beginning of the Greek uprising 1821, we have a new concept in Europe. This is what we use today, humanitarian intervention. Humanitarian intervention as a term in international diplomacy entered in the arena with the Greek uprising. And throughout 19th century, great powers justified their intervention with the term of humanitarian intervention. And this is what considered by Christians as the liberation from Ottoman yoke, and by the Ottomans, it was considered a threat to their own national security. So my central argument is there was an accumulated knowledge, this is the term that I'm using, accumulated knowledge that really shaped the mindset of the Ottomans, which based on the four-pronged, namely these are a four-pronged pattern: reform, demands, massacre, intervention, and secession. This is the history of 19th century. Christians asked reforms, Ottomans suppressed organized massacres, great powers humanitarian intervention, ended with secession of Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, Romania, and so on. So this is the accumulated knowledge which has based on this four-pronged pattern. And then Ottoman Christians' demand for the reforms become caught between the screws of European internal security and the Ottoman perception of being under threat. When 1913, after the Balkan War, Armenians asked the reforms. Negotiations started 1913 summer months. And for this negotiation, Armenian reform negotiation, they took 1895 May reform proposal as their basis. When they signed 1914 February, the reform agreement, it was clear for Ottomans it is the beginning of the end for them. This is four-pronged: reforms, massacre, intervention, secession. They thought it is the beginning of an independent Armenian state. What I'm here going to tell you and finalize my talk is actually Talat Pasha's telegram or letter. So what I propose here has nothing to do with my own ideas. These are actually a summary of a letter written by Talat as interior minister to Ottoman government, dated May 26, 1915. In his statement, Talat describes the reason for the Armenian deportations of 1915. According to him, quote, again, it's not my quote, Armenian reform question, he says, opened the way for the intervention by great powers, which would inevitably result in the partition of Ottoman territory, and the purpose of the deportation was to prevent the intervention of great powers. So, quoting Talat, so as the question of reform, which is completely internal matter of the Ottoman state, has now become an international question as a result of the intervention of the foreign countries. And with some of the Ottoman provinces now passing under foreign influence, it is demanded that certain concessions be granted and that a special administrative organization be created. Nevertheless, Talat continues, since it has been seen through bitter experience 19th century, that reforms and organizations that are created under foreign influence and pressure have led to the dividing and partition of the Ottoman homeland, end quote. Talat relates in that long letter another revelation for us. He says that before the start of the war, underline, before start of the First World War, quote from Talat, deliberations were underway as to how to prepare and implement the means for eliminating this trouble, Armenian reform question, which represent an important section in the list of vital questions of the Ottoman state in a manner that is both comprehensive and absolute, end quote. According to Talat, since the war had broken out, they had to make do with certain provisional measures, but now, in May 1915, the time come to give the problem, quote, an orderly manner of arrangement in accordance with appropriate procedures and principles, end quote. As can be seen, the decision driving the Armenian genocide were not directly related to the exigencies of First World War. Rather, they were directly the result of seeking a solution to the Armenian reform question, which was considered a huge thorn in the side of the Ottomans that had gone on for the better part of the 19th century up to that point. So the aim was to prevent the intervention of the great powers and perceive the inevitable secession of yet more territory from the empire. For this reason, what I'm saying is that the only way to understand Armenian genocide, if we examine it as not as a single event, as a process, and as an Armenian reform question, and on these three different levels that I described above. Thank you very much for listening.
Hi, thank you for being here. Thank you, organizers, for the invitation, and thank you for the introductions. I would like to speak today about an aspect of the Armenian genocide that has been attracting a different kind of attention lately, the gendered and age-conscious dimension of what happened to Armenians and other Ottoman Christian communities during World War I, especially the ways in which many Armenian women and children found themselves in Muslim households and found themselves Islamized. In the last few years, this issue came to the larger public's attention in Turkey, especially thanks to the coming out of the grandchildren of Islamized Armenians. As many of you might know, many Turks today admit that one of their great-grandparents or great-grandparents used to be an Armenian who had been absorbed into a Muslim household during the war years or before the war years during the previous waves of massacres. In my talk today, can you hear me? Is it okay? Okay. In my talk today, which is titled Unmaking a People by Making Them Up, Abduction During the Armenian Genocide, I'll discuss the historical conditions that enabled such a transfer of population from one group to the other. And I organized it in 3 parts. First, I'll present a brief overview of how abduction worked during the Armenian Genocide. Second, I'll discuss the Ottoman and Islamic repertoires and practices that enabled the Young Turks to create what I termed as a climate of abduction during the Great War. In the last part, if I have time, I'll talk about the Ottoman and Turkish archives vis-a-vis this issue. Part 1. Similar to the transfer of property from Armenians to, I'm saying Armenians simply because I did most of my work on Armenians, so usually it's Ottoman Christians also, including the Assyrians, about which we'll hear more. Similar to the transfer of property from Armenians to Muslims and Muslim institutions, including the state, transfer of women and children from Armenians to Muslims and Muslim institutions, such as the orphanages, was an integral part of the whole process and not a byproduct of war as such. Many times when we talk about wars, any war, we talk about rape as a weapon of war, or rape and abduction as unavoidable consequences of mass violence. There's, of course, that component during the Armenian Genocide as well, but what is more interesting and analytically eye-opening, I find, is that abduction and its byproduct, sexual violence, were integral, though non-lethal aspects of the event that began 100 years ago about these days. What did World War I mean to a typical Ottoman Armenian woman or child? End of life, if not, loss of family members, loss of community, loss of control over body and mobility, suppression of native language, new religion, new everyday language, new place, definitely, not definitely, but overwhelming majority, a new community if they are absorbed into a Muslim context, new household, a new family, new children, new husbands, new fathers. And how did this happen? This integration of the Armenian family and the community was one of the ways in which the ruling Young Turk government intended to unmake the Armenian people, which we have in the title of our panel today. The Ottoman archives are full of documents detailing what to do with Armenian orphans and widows. I'll read one document, which is going to show how the government encouraged, ordered, and orchestrated the transfer of women and young children from Armenian milieus to Muslim households and institutions. The date of this document is April 30, 1916. This is definitely not the first of its kind, but it's a quite comprehensive one, and it's a typical one. It's been used by other historians. Taner Akçam used it, Uğur Ümit Üngör used it in their works. So this one particular document is sent from Ministry of Interior, Talat Pasha's office, to the provinces, various provinces. Geographically, it's everywhere, really, such as Adana, Erzurum, Edirne, Aleppo, Hüdavendigar, Sivas, Diyarbakır, Mamuratul Aziz, that's Harput or current Elazığ, Konya, Kastamonu, Trabzon, and the Sanjaks of İzmit, Canik, Eskişehir, Karasarsahip, Maraş, Urfa, Kayseri, and Niğde. It includes 5 orders. First one says, those families, that means women and children, who had been rendered kimsesiz, who are left without anyone, without a guardian or father, because their men, the document says, because their men have been deported or currently serve in the Ottoman army, are to be separately distributed to villages and towns that are without any foreigners or Armenians. Their living expenses are to be paid from the Refugees Fund, and they are to be trained and accustomed to the local customs. Second, young and widowed women are to be married off. Third, children up to the age of 12 are to be distributed to our orphanages, our here meaning Muslim. If orphanages are insufficient for this job, they shall be given to prominent, well-to-do Muslims to be assimilated to local manners and ways of life. And 5, if a sufficient number of such prominent Muslims cannot be found, efforts should be made to distribute them to peasants with the assurance that every month 30 kurush will be paid by the Refugees Fund. And there's another, of course, very common expression in the document saying that regular report of the numbers and figures of who had been transferred to where or taken in or married off are to be sent to the center periodically. The document is pretty self-explanatory. I would like to direct your attention to the fact that the Interior Ministry cares about the futures of the transferred people. They are to be transformed. It is not just a transfer operation, it's a transformation operation. They are to be absorbed in and become one of us and discontinue to stand out. This is not a temporary measure, but a permanent one, which was the same case with the Armenian properties. We see that the emphasis is not just on taking in Armenian women and children and helping them survive, but on de-Armenianizing them by way of Islamizing them or by assimilating them into a variety of Muslim communities, Kurds, Arabs, and Turks being the main ones, but also Caucasians, definitely. Similar to the Armenian historical homeland, and remember the whole issue revolves around territory, right? The Armenian female body and the vulnerable and assimilable child, that is the cornerstone of the Armenian future, were to be emptied out of their content, culture, religion, ways of being, and replaced by the right kind of content, the one that belonged to the groups that were on the perpetrating side of this conflict. It is in fact striking that the perpetrating group came up with strategies to unmake the target group by making a significant portion of the target group a part of the perpetrating group. At the end of the process of abduction, Islamization, forcible name change, isolation from the natal community, these women and children would cease to be part of the problem, but would become part of the solution. They would discontinue populating and reproducing the target group, and it's also all about demographics and human breeding and reproduction, and they would begin populating and reproducing the preferred group, in this case, Muslims. Part 2, why women and children, and how come women and children? What type of a historical repertoire rendered this transfer policy thinkable for the Ottoman state, and what was it that made it feasible and successful on the ground? First, we should pay attention to how these groups understood the difference that separated each other. The Ottoman Turkish authorities who created this wartime climate of abduction were Ottomans after all. Therefore, they conceived difference on religious terms rather than, for instance, race and blood. This does not mean that Committee of Union and Progress leaders had not become increasingly radical or that they did not use racist vocabulary. On the contrary, they did refer to Anatolian Armenians as tumors, requiring an operation, for instance, or leeches feeding on Muslims, or as, quote, microbes within the organism of the fatherland that had to be eliminated for good. Yet, such terminology did not preclude conception and implementation of policies based on the assumption that the difference between groups were not innate and indelible, but rather changeable. During the Armenian genocide, the Ottoman government's goal did not necessitate the killing or deporting of every human being considered Armenian. Those who were conceived of lacking the capacity to transmit group identity could be spared death and deportation, for simply they did not matter. Given the patrilineal logic shared by both Christian and Muslim in this geography and endorsed by law of both groups, it's easily deduced that it was females who did not matter to group identity. Women reproduced groups socially and had huge symbolic importance, but they did not define the group. Any child a woman bore automatically belonged to the father's family and his community, his religion. For the shared logic of paternity in Islam and Christianity dictates that the father is the sole creator. Women do contribute physiologically to the child, but in no way are they taught to engender it. By not attributing the mother any role in procreation, this monogenetic mentality reduces the womb to an empty vessel or a field that takes the shape and form of whatever fluid fills it in, the seed. In order to clarify this point, let's think of it comparatively. Holocaust presents a good opportunity because it's very different. According to Nazis, Jewishness was a fixed identity. It was something Jews, regardless of their sex or age, carried in their dirty blood, and mixing of that with the clear Aryan blood was a crime. During the Holocaust, rape was officially forbidden, and when it did happen, and it did happen, Jewish victims were usually killed in order to prevent racial pollution or defilement. Therefore, abduction for extinction was unthinkable during the Holocaust. On the other hand, the blood of Armenian women was seen to be devoid of the capacity to pollute the Muslim nation because it had no agency or consequence. Therefore, abduction for extinction was possible. It was not only possible, however, it was also preferable. By the time that World War I reached the Ottoman lands, many politicians and bureaucrats had already internalized the idea, the Ottoman ruling elite, they internalized the idea that a given country's demographic profile was proof of its strength. We have new studies coming and showing that even from early Tanzimat on, from 1840s on, they had this anxiety, this demographic anxiety. They were anxious about the dangers of depopulation. This is also common in many other contexts, of course, that an operation such as the wholesale deportation of Armenians could pose, especially at a time of such high-scale mobilization. In this framework, then, it made more sense to recycle Armenian women and children than to discard them. Moreover, like the temptations provided by property and real estate, easy access to an Armenian or other Christian woman or child could motivate people to kill their neighbors, remain bystanders to their disappearance, or refuse to provide help. Another important factor that enabled this transfer policy was the fact that women and children were seen as incapable of organizing resistance. Once they changed their religion, name, and language, their loyalties were sure to change. Of course, so this is what makes the current grandchildren's moment kind of interesting, because clearly not all of them have acted as they were supposed to act, despite the fact that they did become Muslims and ceased to be a security threat to the Turkish state, Ottoman state. And the CUP knew, the Ottoman cadres must have known that this transfer of loyalties would not happen overnight. This is one of the reasons why the documents ordering women and children mention that they should be sheltered in towns and villages without Armenians, or that efforts should be made to acculturate them to their new surroundings. Isolation from the natal group, was considered necessary for successful assimilation. Moreover, even if they did not immediately and sincerely change their alliances, because basically they forcibly changed sides, it was believed that these formerly Armenian women and children would not pose a significant challenge to the project of getting rid of Armenians, given their biological and social inabilities. The same was true about children, even boys. Boys under 12 or 10 were usually seen as incapable of organizing resistance, therefore they did not pose a challenge. In my larger work, I've also looked at it, the previous Ottoman practices that enabled such a conception of transfer. I'll just mention them in passing, such as for the children, the institution of devshirme, I think, plays, it's there, right? Non-Muslim boys turning into Muslim men, basically, through some policies that the state implements. Abduction into banditry have been practiced in the Ottoman lands for the longest time. Besleme, evlatlık, foster children is also a very common Ottoman practice. Both Muslims and non-Muslims do it. In terms of abduction What is abduction? It's always been practiced in Anatolia. Even before Turks arrived there, like Greek mythology is full of abduction. It means power and masculinity, abduction. This honors the victim and the whole enemy group, especially their men, because they failed to protect. Asserts victory over other men in that regard. And sultans too abducted. Ottoman sultans did reproduce, actually, if you think about how most wives of Ottoman sultans were originally non-Muslim, mostly Christian women who had been converted and included into the Ottoman royal family. But no one would question the Muslimness of the royal family, despite the fact that originally half of what we would now call half of the matter came from a non-Muslim, original non-Muslim partner. There are also material benefits to this: free labor, sexually available females and children, wives without bride price requirements or natal family to intervene. Might be considered charitable. I think many people did consider this charitable. They are basically including someone who would have been otherwise killed or dead or would perish. So it increases the household head's charisma among the group and the prestige, really. In the last few minutes that I have, I'll talk about what have been very interesting for me to observe, which is the fact that these documents, I think, Taner Hoca, you have also mentioned it in your previous talk, these documents, including the one that I read to you, are readily available in the sense that they are not. So I did do this research without going to the Ottoman archives, Turkish archives, simply because the Turkish government, the Turkish Republic Prime Ministry, General Directorate of the State Archives, published them. They have volumes titled Armenians in Ottoman Documents, in which they select and transliterate Ottoman state documents to modern Turkish and English and publish them. Their main goal in doing this is, of course, to negate the genocide thesis. And when you look at the definition, even if you just randomly Google genocide and you look at the definition of genocide, it's at least 2 of the 5 things that qualify something for genocide. 2 of them are related to these documents. So I was puzzled, really, that how come they were, what happened, what went wrong that they made these documents available. Because they clearly indicated the Ottoman state's intent to do exactly what the Genocide Convention mentions. There can be a number of explanations. First, that they really did not do their homework and study what exactly it was that they were rejecting. Second, this is an indication of a larger process, I thought. In the 1980s and 90s, even in the early 2000s, Turkish official narrative relied on the argument that the Armenian case was no Holocaust, and that applying the term genocide to the wartime deportation of Armenians would threaten both the concept of genocide and the legacy of the Holocaust. Indeed, Turkish officials' argumentation was in line with and inspired by the emerging field of genocide studies, which emphasized the Holocaust's uniqueness, that it could not and should not be compared with other cases. And it's true, as I mentioned, when you look at the experiences of women and children, Holocaust and Armenian genocide are different poles. Holocaust is a major rape avoidance case, despite the fact that they both qualify for the same kind of crime. Also, there's another tendency, which I think is shared by the people who compiled these collections, as well as many Turkish nationalist scholars who work on this issue. Actually, the first person who wrote, there are only 2 books, actually, about 2 book-length studies of Armenian women and children, Armenian and other Christian groups during the genocide in its immediate aftermath. And the first person, I'm done, 20 minutes, in the last 30 seconds, is the person who did this, Ibrahim Ethem Atnur, but others also. They present all these documents to show that there was no genocide, that in fact there was a humanitarian way of taking care of the women and children of the deported Armenian males. They simply missed the point that, I think, there's the fact that they had to go through the Armenianization doesn't mean that it means that there was another point there. They simply missed the point that physical wholesale annihilation is not necessary for an event to qualify for the crime of genocide. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation to speak today. I am going to talk about the non-Armenian Christians who were affected by the First World War. There is now a realization that what has been called the Armenian genocide is much more complicated and involves more target groups than the Armenians. This includes then secondary targets like the Assyrians, the Greeks, and I would also throw into the equation the Yazidis. And it has a lot of consequences for how we are thinking about what was going on in Turkey or Ottoman Empire at that time. The Assyrians that I will be talking about are also the ancestors of those Assyrians in Syria and Iraq that are the target of ISIS during this year and the past year. Now, thinking about the other target groups actually expands the territory of the history of the genocide to the extremity of southeastern Anatolia and to northern Mesopotamia, and it even spills into parts of northwestern Iran. On the second, it expands the chronology to include many genocidal acts both before the 24th of April in 1915, which is usually taken as the starting point of the genocide, but it also pushes the end date into the mid-1920s and perhaps even further. And that is during the time of the establishment of the Republic of Turkey. It also removes Kemal Atatürk of his clean reputation that exists from World War I. If we include the Yazidis, we may be talking about a process of elimination or mass forced conversion going back to the 1840s. Including Assyrians and Greeks into the narrative, also, as Tanner was indicating earlier, it reduces the importance of the political and nationalistic aspect of the political life of the Ottoman, the Young Turks, as these groups had a very weak expression of a will to have an autonomy. They did not have a revolutionary feeling. At the same time, it increases the religious and ethnic aspect in that they were all non-Muslim populations. It also increases the number of victims of the genocide in a way that we have not even begun to calculate. It means also, and I am in agreement with Tanner, that we can see a continuity in violent demographic displacement sponsored by the government and going on since the 1800s. And it is coupled, if you look at it from a sociological point of view, with a persistent regional genocidal violence among the population, with beliefs that are based on their interpretation of Islam, that allows them to attack their local non-Muslim neighbors. Since the 1970s, Sweden, where I work, has received wave after wave of refugees from the Middle East, and a large portion of them are Christian minorities from Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, but above all from Turkey. And most of these refugees go under the international umbrella term of Assyrians, though the group itself doesn't agree on this this term, it being a cover for about 4 different religious groups who have a history of being rivals to each other. Now, as far as the Assyrians in general go, there is a difference between them and the Armenians. For the first, they speak a Semitic language, which is close to Arabic and Hebrew. They are in a territory that is sort of squeezed below that of Armenian settlement and before in the middle of Kurdish and Arab territory. In all probability, and this is based on anecdotes, the Assyrians got along much better with the Kurds than the Armenians did, so they had more friends that would protect them. Inside Europe, an Assyrian diaspora has established itself since the 1970s in Holland and Germany, and particularly in Sweden, where the city of Södertälje plays the same role for the Assyrians that Glendale, California plays for the Armenians, with an intellectual base there, radio, TV, and the like. My university is placed right in the middle of this. It's a new university. I helped to build it up. And I had many students who pushed me and supported me to investigate this genocide, which they had heard from their parents and grandparents. They call it the Year of the Sword, the Year of Sepho. And they modeled their memory work and the commemoration and also a drive for political recognition of genocide on the Armenians. They even took the same date, the 24th of April, for commemoration, and then complained to me that, gee, we're being obscured by the Armenians. I said that they still have not found their own date for this. Early estimates of the number of Assyrian victims were presented at the Versailles Peace Treaty. They range from 180,000 to 250,000 victims, and this was calculated guess-wise as 50% of the original population. Most of the survivors had been pushed out of their home territories and found themselves far from home in Syria or Iraq. In both cases, they were being used by the Mandate powers, France and Britain, as mercenaries, or in what became the Soviet Union, which was a bad place to be in. At first, there was very little to go on besides the memories of the families. There was one book, an oral history of survivors made in Syria, and a chronicle written by a monk outside of Mardin, a Syrian-Armenian town, and none of it was in any major language save Arabic. Documents began coming out of the woodwork from my students and their families, restaurant owners, wholesalers in fruit and vegetables, owners of furniture stores, and the like. And none of it, all of this began to look like a genocide that I knew from my studies of the Baltic countries. Much of it corroborated what the Assyrian memory had asserted, and this was very important for the diaspora since there was a conflict between them and some high school students and teachers who had gotten their information from the our friendly local Turkish embassy, that it had not happened. But the Assyrian documentation had the additional and unexpected benefit of giving us a new perspective on what was happening to the Armenians. In towns like Mardin, which were mixed with Armenians and Assyrians, the Armenians were taken first and the Assyrians later. And they were able to chronicle what was going on. So we have an amount of detail about what happened to the Armenians that you usually do not have. Now, I have added to the memory work documents from the Ottoman archives, which I was able to get to already in 2005. And I had some help in that with an unnamed professor who now works at a college university in Massachusetts. I won't name him at all because I promised I never would. Now, I have been working with two cases in which the paper trail of Assyrian places leads up to the government in Constantinople, and it shows that they knew that the people that they were talking about were not Armenians, but were Assyrians. It was not a case of mistaken identity covered by collateral damage. The first case is that of a large village close to the border with Syria that resisted attempts and a siege for such a long time, 3 or 4 months, that the army was diverted in order to deal with this. And the Ottoman Empire was a bureaucratic empire. So there was a lot of, I got it. There was a lot of telegrams sent back and forth to Constantinople and to Diyarbakir and other places in order to motivate this and also explain it. Telegrams were sent to the Third Army in order to divert this military expedition on its way to Iran. The Third Army Command also had to contact Enver Pasha, the Minister of War, in order to implement this. Also, because military advisors from Germany were in place in this expedition, telegrams were sent to von der Goltz Pasha, the senior military advisor from the German side. Also, the German diplomatic corps was involved, and going up to the German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, and back and forth. So around a little village of no strategic importance at all for the war, there was about 30 secret telegrams sent back and forth about the suppression of this place. There was a pretense in the beginning that they were Armenians in this village. Turned out to be some refugees had fled from the deportation trail. What this shows is that for one village, 40 telegrams and other documents, both in Turkish and in German archives, exist. In the end, this village was spared because it resisted, Enver promising to come back at a more opportune time and suppress it. But it shows, okay, if we have one Assyrian village with 40 telegrams involved, how much more is there for the Armenian resistance? We just don't know. But it promises that the military archives are going to be a very rich mine. 2, I'm dealing with the Assyrian tribes of the Hakkari Mountains. The Ottoman government was suspicious of their loyalty already from even before the war began, and there was a deportation order for them in the end of October 1914, which did not get implemented because the war broke out. This was an order from Talat Pasha to remove the Assyrians from the border to Iran, to Konya and other places in central Anatolia. Now, Talat's suspicion that the Assyrians were disloyal was probably correct. When the city of Van was besieged by its governor, Jevdet Bey, in the 20th of April, 1915, a Russian relief column was sent to relieve the Armenians, and the Assyrians of Hakkari joined in, stopping a relief column coming from the Turkish army side. For this, the Assyrians were pushed out of the Hakkari Mountains into Iran, but that's another story. What this also shows is the extreme involvement of the Minister of the Interior, again, and the Minister of War in pushing the Assyrians out. They were to be punished. They were never to be allowed to come back. And this was a very violent campaign involving the military. So, what kind of conclusions can be drawn by looking at the Assyrian case? Well, one has to do with how we look at genocide. Genocide is usually conceived as to have been perpetrated by very evil people against completely innocent victims. And we can't say in the Assyrian case that they were completely innocent of contacts with foreign governments, of being disloyal to the state. But still, they were massacred and dispersed and ethnically cleansed in a way that is nothing but genocide. So we have to rethink our thought about what actually is a victim. Now, also, there is a degree in which the Assyrian genocide has been in the shadow of the Armenians. I already mentioned that this was sort of natural if you take the 24th of April as the starting point of the Assyrian genocide. Most people explain this, well, we thought we would get support from the Armenians if we joined in on their, but the Armenians actually had problems of their own in this. A third thing, and I mentioned the Yazidis in the very beginning because they, especially the Yazidis of the Sinjar Mountains in Assyrian documents, are the saviors. They were going out into the desert collecting both Armenian and Assyrians who were being pushed into the desert in the deportations. Built up a colony with houses, school, church, an Assyrian priest. And for this, they were also punished later on, as they are today. So I stopped there. I've sort of given you a potpourri of things that you can see if you look wider than just to the Armenian target group. I thank you.
Is that better? Okay, thank you. So just to repeat briefly, we've got three distinguished historians here. You can already tell that they've been talking about their research about the archives, and I'd like this Q&A session to focus on historical aspects. We do have two other panels to talk about more contemporary aspects. And let me go first and take the benefit of having three historians here who've done years and years of research and ask you each whether each of you has one big unanswered question that you would like to see answered about this whole period of the Armenian genocide. One sort of research question which you think deserves a big question which deserves more attention. We have a very full picture, but obviously we don't have a complete picture. And who would like to?
I mean, I have a very specific issue. The specific one, I mean, two issue I would like to raise. The first issue, you may never thought about it, the Andonian documents. I think it is worthwhile to have a really research on the authenticity of the Andonian documents.
You should probably explain to those who don't know.
What is the Andonian documents? Aram Andonian was an Armenian intellectual. He was also deported April 24 and survived the deportation. And in Aleppo, he compiled a series of memoirs from the surviving Armenians. And during that period in Aleppo, he got from an Ottoman official whose name was Naim Bey, and he got a couple of telegrams from this Naim Bey. These are the ciphered telegrams, and Aram Andonian published these materials without knowing English and French. It was published English and French, and then in Armenian language. The complete was one, the Armenian language, and which was used also as an evidence in Talat Pasha process, 1921 in March in Berlin. And we don't know where the originals of these materials are today. They are vanished. And in 1983, two Turkish historians wrote a book. It's approximately 200, 300 pages book, and they claimed that these materials are not authentic. So it's not, they are forgeries. So my desire now is really to work on it and to show that they are actually authentic documents, because the importance of the Andonian documents is there are two sets of materials there. One is what we call it smoking guns. These are the telegrams from Istanbul sent by Talat saying that kill all Armenian, nobody should be alive, and so on and so forth. And there are other set of documents basically related to deportation. And I can give you the good news. This second category of materials that Andonian published basically related on the deportation, I have found the similar and the same documents in Ottoman archive. So this is the first. On the second one, I'm not going to talk in details, but this is worthwhile to research. And the second important question for me is really to analyze the Armenian reform question. This is another interesting discovery that I made. It was amazed me that nobody mentioned it. Really, 1909, February, the Sadrazam, the Prime Minister Kamil Pasha, along with the British ambassador in Istanbul, made a reform proposal to Ottoman Parliament, and then during Adana massacre, this was heatedly debated in Ottoman Parliament and rejected 1909 June. You cannot find one single reference to this reform debate in 1909. So this I read from the German ambassador Bieberstein in his report on 1909, and it opened my eyes. Then this is where I am now working on that topic, 1894, 1909, 1915.
For me, I am very curious about the wartime Istanbul. We talk about being 24th of April being the date that the intellectuals were deported. We know who have been deported, their background, how the list was prepared, and what happened to them. But we don't know how Istanbul is a very different case, right? It didn't experience a mass massacring or deportation. So how the Istanbul Armenian community experienced these 4 years, I think, is going to be very interesting to know more about. One aspect that also, I think, deserves more attention is the gendered consequence of the fact that more than 99% of the people who have been deported, intellectuals, professionals, the leadership, the Armenian brain team in April from Istanbul, they are all men, except for 2 of them. 2 of them were in the list. So how does it change the intelligentsia, the Armenian intelligentsia, in Istanbul, both during the war years, but also in its immediate aftermath.
Okay, if we are looking at the Armenian genocide as a general anti-non-Muslim campaign, and with religious aspects to it, there is a great wide white blank field, and that is what the religious leaders were actually doing and thinking. We can get into the Ottoman archives these days, we can get into Russian, German, other archives. The only religious archive that is open to us is the Vatican, and they were very, very knowledgeable about what was going on, but they were interested in the Catholics, of course. No historian has been able to look at the Syrian Orthodox Church or the Assyrian Church of the East documentation. We know that a lot of hanky-panky, can you use that word, was going on between their leaders and the Ottomans about this. Bribes were being paid in order for some people to be saved and others not. There was infighting between the various Assyrian denominations that has sores that exist even today. And we really need to develop that religious side of what is going on before we can say that it's more than just a speculation that the religious aspect is important. So,
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to take a few questions. Please wait for the microphone, introduce yourself, and again, a plea to try and sort of keep this to a historical discussion and not stray too much into contemporary, the issues that we'll discuss in later panels. Let's start at the back, Yusuf.
My name is David Loudon. I'm a policy analyst. I'm very interested in hearing from Tanner regarding the military tribunal and its shortcomings or failings or just insights.
Of 1919 you're referring to, yeah?
Yes, 1919 to 1922.
Okay, we'll take a few rows in front of you. There was someone. Yes, you, sir.
Hi, my name is Enes Pinar. I'm a Turkish American, and I had a question. Of concern to me is to me, my perception is a double standard when it comes to the accusation of genocide. We're talking about the Ottomans. Why do we never hear about Armenian genocide? For example, when the Armenian volunteers, the head of the Russian army, entered the city of Van in 1915, there were approximately anywhere from 40,000 to 80,000 Muslims massacred, every woman, man, and child. Doesn't that constitute genocide? I noticed in the past Professor Akçam referred to it as war crimes. But in Srebrenica, when the Serbs did it to 8,000 people, they were hauled before the Hague on charges of genocide. So why do we not hear about the Armenian genocide?
Thank you. And Omer, wait for the microphone. Yourself.
Perhaps in continuity, Ömer Taşpınar with National Defense University in Brookings. Perhaps in continuity with the last question, one of the reasons why there is genocide denial in Turkey is the sense that Turks are singled out, and that what happened to them, what happened to Muslims in the Balkans, in the Caucasus, is not called genocide. So my first question would be, should we be more liberal in our terminology and the use of the term genocide in the way that it's part of nation building, ethnic nation building in the context of the Balkans, Caucasus? There seems to be a kind of Turkish allergy to the term of genocide because Turks are often projected as perpetrators, but obviously there have been genocides, and if we use the term at a kind of micro level and look at communities, what happened in the Balkans, in the Caucasus, should we be more open to accepting these events of the 19th century and events perpetrated against Muslims as genocides as well. My second question would be, since in the panel we don't have a historian who would basically deny that what happened was a genocide, the name of Justin McCarthy comes to mind. As historians, how would you deal with the arguments of reputable historians who basically dispute that this was clearly a genocide? Is it on historical grounds that you would dispute their claims, or is it on the terminology of genocide and the technical definition of genocide? In other words, if we had someone representing the so-called Turkish view, how would you deal with such viewpoints? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's stop there. Although, of course, the so-called Turkish view, we do have two people from Turkey on the panel. Anyway.
No, it's a perfect point, actually. What is Turkish, what is Armenian view, and as if there were ethnically oriented views, some social problems. I don't want to go on this denialism aspect. You know, personally, I respect the denialists with their political point of view, but it has no merit. I don't want to spend 1 second on that topic. So for me, it is very clear, and I'm ready to debate and discuss on the ground of my own publication and other publication on genocide research. And we are way ahead of these two sides of the story discourse. So I don't take them seriously. And I only did with Günter Levy's book. You might know about it. Günter Levy's book was distributed by Turkish consulars and embassies as one of the serious book, and I took this book apart. The problem with denialism is, Ömer, if you deal with it, you cannot really proceed the genocide research per se. The best way for me in that sense, after I took apart the Günter Levy's book, I am looking for my own, or the genocide scholar, we are looking for our own research. I have to add maybe to the first question, what is developing in our field is the local histories. There are now young scholars really developing macrocosm studies for each cities, which is really we are missing in our genocide research. So the question of Muslims and the Balkans, yes, of course we have to deal with it like we deal with the German expulsion from Czech Republic or German expulsion from Poland. The problem in the debate is these other mass atrocities in Balkan or Caucasus are always counterpart, as used as an excuse against the Armenian genocide argument. I'm all in favor of debating the Balkan expulsion of the Muslims and incorporate it in a broader perspective. We don't have any problem. But the problem is if you start using these as an argument against the genocide, then it becomes a political issue. This is exactly true for let's say, the Armenian volunteers massacres in Van or in Caucasus area. We never refrain not mentioning, we mentioned these massacres. And in Caucasus, 1914, it had started August and then continued all the way. And it is, of course, important to incorporate all kind of mass atrocities in this broader process. The major argument is these massacres, or let's say the wide range of Armenian uprisings, these were used as an argument against the genocide. But as you know, in Rwandan case, there was a Rwandan Liberation Front marching with its army in Rwanda, and genocide occurred during that period. So the important problem is not mentioning the mass atrocities in small scales during the war. The problem is why we use these as an argument against the genocide claim. This is the important part. Military tribunals, the basic knowledge is, I think we published in English with Hakan Dadrian, the trials and the verdicts and the indictment of the tribunals. There were, after the war, three major attempts. The Paris Peace Conference, they wanted to establish an international criminal court, never successful, and it was established in 2000. Second attempt, the British government, they tried the perpetrator on Malta. It never came to a trial. And then the third attempt was taken by Ottoman government in Istanbul. They established the military tribunal 1918 November, and they started 1919 February all the way to 1922. There were two major reasons for this trial. Number one, to get positive result from Paris Peace Conference, because it was always reminded the Turks, if you want to get a positive result from Paris, you have to try the perpetrator. And this is what they did. But they didn't get what they expected. And there were altogether 63 trials in Istanbul, not only 2 or 3 that you know, 63 trials, and there were approximately around 200 defendants, and at the end there were around 16, 17 death penalties, and 3 were hanged. 1 in 1919 April, and 2 in 1920 summer, July. Why the trials ended? This is the wonderful letter, I call it. It's an incredible letter of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk that he formulated August 8, 1920, when the conditions of Sevr was clear, that the Ottoman Empire were partitioned among Kurds, Turks, Greeks, and the Armenians, and the Atatürk, Mustafa Kemal, wrote a letter to Istanbul government and said, this trial or hanging of the fatherland children, he called it, is nonsense, because it didn't bring what they expected. It is very interesting question. This is my last important information for you. Had the Great Britain accepted the nationalist demand, namely trial as a price for the national boundary of Turkey today, Lausanne, what they was asking actually, what would have the history be seen today? If Great Britain had accepted the nationalist demand, trial as a price for national boundaries of Turkey, we would have talked today a total different history. And my example for those Holocaust experts is compare this with Morgenthau Plan 1945. When Morgenthau Plan was considered to separate Germany in 6 small states to weaken it, the American Defense Secretary said that stop this, because then you will salute the Nazis as national liberator. Concentrate only on Nuremberg trials. And this is the reason when we discuss today on on Holocaust, we remember the Nuremberg trials, but when we discuss on Armenian genocide, we mostly discuss the Sevr, Lausanne, and national security issues. I think this is the frame that I would put the trials.
As far as genocide, you said that, well, genocide seemed to be rather common. And from the point of view of a genocide scholar, the problem is that genocides are not very common at all. I think we have about 12, 13 in modern history to compare with each other, all in very different places and all discontinuity over time. But one of the essential elements of determining if it is a genocide is the involvement of governments in it over a long time. That's why I was talking so much about the paper trail leading all the way from a small village up to the top. I also mentioned that my Assyrian, the people I study, they were killing Turkish military and Turkish civilians in revenge. They were also part of Antranik's volunteers in Van, and so maybe some of this 40 to 80,000 Muslims were killed by that. what I did then was to turn it around. Maybe our definition of genocide needs to be adjusted as far as how to see a victim. A victim cannot be simply assumed to be an innocent victim. But I am like Tanner. I don't care what it is called, what it is categorized. My sympathy is with the victims, and they were being killed for other reasons than it was a genocide. It wasn't called a genocide then, of course. So that's my point of view. But I absolutely will admit that innocent Turkish Muslims and Kurdish Muslims were being killed. Yes. But they did not have a government behind them.
Great, thank you. Who's going to go next? Okay, we'll start with at the back, actually. It's Eric and Emil.
I wonder if, Eric Lahr from American University. I wonder if someone could just comment on the recent argument of Umut Ungur and the way in which he puts the centrality of property, of the transfer of property from Armenians to others as the key to the process as it unfolded. Thank you.
Emil.
Thanks, Emil Stanimian. Thanks for the presentations. I enjoyed listening. Two questions, probably for Professor Akçam and Lerna, regarding first Turkey's decision on entering the World War I. Of course, it was decision born out of considerable diplomacy as well as local decision making. In the past, genocide would be connected, would be seen as a byproduct of World War I, Turkish participation in World War I. Now, it seems to me the understanding is shifting to the Turkish participation in World War I being byproduct of this longer-term demographic policies of the government. If you could comment on that relationship in the decision-making, whether the decision to enter the war had to do with the demographic program as well. For Lerna, regarding the groups that were excluded from the genocide, how did those decisions go? Obviously, they varied from area to area. Istanbul was a specific case. Some of the other places in the west of Asia Minor. But how did those excluded groups were defined, and if you could talk a little bit about that and what the size of them was compared to the affected groups, as far as Armenians, say. And Professor Gont perhaps could talk about the Assyrians as well in that sense. Were there groups that were excluded from the deportations and massacres?
And we'll take one more in this round from Kamal.
It's Kemal Kirişçi. I'm the moderator for the next panel. But I know Ömer is a very grown-up person and can stand up for himself. But Taner, I'd like to go back to the question that Ömer raised. What I liked about your framework and your choice of the term process relates to the question that I think Ömer has raised. In the third leg of your framework, you talk about the collapse of empires and the impact of nation-state building on the Armenian genocide talking about. Now, what I would be very interested in is the role of Tom in his book refers to Eric Zürcher, a Dutch historian, and the way in which in the last 10 years of the Ottoman Empire, 2.5 million Muslims and Turks died, and there was large numbers of dislocation. I'd be very interested to read an article or hear the way in which that phenomenon impacts on the process. I know that some of the people that worked in the Ottoman bureaucracy that got involved in the Armenian genocide, there were people who were part of that deportation from the Balkans or related to the experience itself. I'm very curious. I'd like to learn more about how that impacts on the decision to go ahead with what you described to us in such and detailed.
Back to.
Yeah, I can go first. If I understand you correctly, you're talking about, so when you mention groups who were excluded from genocide, do you mean the women and children who had been abducted? No.
Geographically as well.
Geographically also. I don't know the percentage. I mean, we know if you consider Istanbul as one of the places that have been excluded, Istanbul is one case, Izmir is one case. I guess Kütahya is like, no?
Not excluded. It's a debate for itself. There were deportations from Istanbul, and the number of deportees, it's a small group of people beginning 1915 April, and more than 10,000 Armenians were deported from the city of Istanbul. They developed certain criteria which should be deported from Istanbul. Those who were born outside of the Istanbul, unemployed, and the member of political organization. Based on these three categories at the beginning, they started the deported Armenian from April to all the way to November, and then German government intervened and the deportation stopped in Istanbul. There were deportations from Smyrna, Izmir also, and it was also stopped by the intervention of Liman von Sanders. He officially threatened the governor of Smyrna. So the overall plan was actually to deport the entire Armenian population.
Then I guess there's no exclusion that we should speak to.
Of course, in official order, there were some exclusions. For example, according to central government's decision, and this was a continuous friction between Defense Ministry and the Interior Ministry, the soldiers' families should be deported. It was a government decision, but we know from the experience and from the other examples, soldiers' families were not exempt. They were also deported. But in certain areas, this is the importance of the local history. We have to look in which area really the soldiers' families were not deported. And the second important category is the Catholic and Protestant Armenians, and there are a fluctuation on that also. Until 1915 August, all Protestant and Catholic Armenians deported, but with the intervention of German government again, then there were certain exemptions, and these were all regulated on the statistic populations. The central government based its deportation policy on the demography, and they what I call it 5 to 10% regulation. They basically didn't deport Armenians, for example, in certain areas in western part if they were less than 5%, and in eastern historic Armenia they deported all Armenians without any exceptions, and their policy for the settlement area was 10%. And it's very interesting to know that the entire deportation process was controlled by this Office of Statistics within the Interior Ministry. So they were getting regularly, almost daily basis, numbers about the Armenians and their percentages to each other. So it was a calculated demographic policy, and within that policy there were certain exemptions, but local authorities used their really power in that regard because bribery played an important role. So we don't know exactly what really happened in each local area.
If I should say something from the Assyrian point of view, the border between the province of Diyarbakir and the province of Mosul was the marking of the safe area. If you came into the province of Mosul, you were saved. We even have a case in which an Assyrian village, Feshkabur, it's a rather large town now, was attacked by a Kurdish tribe, and the governor of Mosul punished the Kurds for doing that. So we don't know the decision behind that, and we're still looking for it. Now, getting to the question that Uğur makes of that the property is the central thing. I don't think the question of Armenian and Assyrian property can be held separate from the demographic engineering. Why do you want to get rid of people? Well, it's because they have property that you want to get hold of. It's the two things go hand in hand. What we're seeing is an idea of a total change of the social and economic structure of this coming state, a total change, and that means new people in new positions. So, thank you.
The question of the Balkan.
Question of properties and the Balkan issue. Properties, I think in these days, my book is in English available on the confiscation of Armenian properties. I don't think that the economic wealth of Armenian played an important role in decision-making process. We don't have any evidence for it. But we know as soon as they started the deportations, they also developed laws and regulation how to regulate the remaining properties. First, mid of 1915, and then 1st May, 10 July, 26 September, and there was several laws and regulations, and last one is 1923 by Turkish government in Ankara, which is the basis of the properties. These laws is a very interesting to analyze because state consciously used the Armenian wealth for certain purposes. I published all these documents. Number one, Armenian properties were used to settle Muslim immigrants. Number two, Armenian properties were used to finance the war. For example, the crops and so on were sold, and then the revenues were given to the military. And number three, Armenian properties were used to create a new Muslim bourgeoisie. This is not my terms. They use that, a new entrepreneurship. The Muslim, this is the third purpose. And the fourth, an important number of Armenian properties were used as school, hospital, or prison. And if you like to discuss the denialism, if you read the denialist arguments, they would say that during genocide there were trials. Those Ottoman officials who misused or their power and mistreat the Armenians, they were tried. This is one of the central arguments. It is true. There were more than 1,000 trials. Against whom? Against those Ottoman officials who really stolen the Armenian properties for their own purposes. There was no one single case against one Ottoman officials who participated in killing operations, but there were hundreds of court cases against those Ottoman officials who misused the Armenian properties for their own purposes. And this is the importance of how really Ottoman government was keen to use these Armenian properties. Today, it is one of the central questions in recognition of Armenian genocide. I think the reparation question is the elephant in the room. Nobody really touches in the detail. This is one of the major problems. Related to the Balkan, two anecdotes, because we don't have much time. 1918, when in Ottoman Parliament, the Greek deputies were complaining and criticizing Ottoman genocide for the massacres and killing. One of the, I think Ihsan Sabri Bey, was it Mush, he was one of the participants of the genocide, which was arrested later by British authorities. He stand up and said that, we learned this from you. This shows an attitude of really Union and Progress Party. It is true that really the Union and Progress nationalism kind of took the Balkan nationalism as an example for themselves. And then, indeed, those Muslim immigrants who came and settled in certain areas, they became perpetrators during the Armenian genocide. They were used, and we published all these telegrams. Ottoman authorities from the central government, they sent telegrams, find us the immigrants because they are ready to participate in that process. And they built one of the important source of Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa, the special organization, was these Muslim immigrants came from Balkan and Caucasus. Related to the Muslim death, my second anecdote, it is the Bitlis governor Abdulhak Nuri, and he told the British American missionaries, because there were a lot of Muslims also dying during that period, and he said that to the American missionary, this is God's punishment to us, because of they couldn't bury the Armenian bodies, and it created disease in that area, and as a result of this disease in Bitlis area, there were a lot of Muslim casualties also. So this is the governor called this as the God's punishment of the crimes. It is, I mean, in every war, people perish, it's true, and the Muslim perished during the First World War also, but like the Germans in Second World War, the number of German casualties are more than actually the Holocaust victims. But this doesn't prevent us to discuss Holocaust as a state policy.
Thank you. Well, I think we've got time for one more round, maybe, you, sir. But I also want to mention Lena gave her presentation on the suppression of the story of women and children, and I don't want to reproduce the suppression of women and children by no one asking her any questions. So if anyone has a question to Lena, I will take that first. Well, in fact, these two ladies and this gentleman here. Yeah.
Lena, can you tell me the census of the number of women that were tried to be Islamized? And were they successful?
And behind you.
Essentially the same question.
Okay. You, sir.
Thank you very much. I am Dr. Nisar Chaudhry with the Pakistan American League. And it's little small reference and a question. The reference is that the first Britisher who he was given access to the Mughal Empire in India was Mr. Hawkins, and he went to the Darbar of Emperor Jahangir, and he liked him so much that he started staying there. And Mr. Hakan, the emperor arranged his marriage with an Armenian girl. So he lived happily with the Armenian girl in India. And this was just a small reference. My question is that the best thing is that generally we discuss current affairs, but in this case you are talking about history, which is very important because history is our teacher. And we learn so much from history lessons for the future as well. And my question is that since we are debating this case, and even though there had been many Holocausts, does it mean the case is still open? And how can it be brought to closure if it is open? Thank you.
What's open?
Debate. Now, there was another lady who had put her arm up. Did you have a question? Yes. Yeah.
I was wondering about the motivation for the Assyrian genocide or pogrom or whatever term you want to apply.
Okay.
And what period?
Motivation.
Please.
Okay.
Okay, now, I'm afraid you've already had one, so I'm going to not take you for the time being. Stephen, and next to you.
Stephen Keat, former Foreign Service officer. First, I want to thank all of you for an excellent series of presentations. I've learned a lot. One of the things I found very interesting was the difference in how women and victims of rape were treated by the Nazis and how this was handled in the Armenian case. For all three of you, would there be other examples that you'd want to give of things that are particularly different between these two cases and things that you consider to be critically similar? Thank you.
The lady next to you. And then...
Diane Compellion, clinical psychologist.
first a comment. My aunt raised in Istanbul told me that what happened there was a lot of targeted burnings of particular houses, particular streets. Just a fact to toss in. I interviewed a number of people for various studies, and I heard, and I have since read, the same kind of story over and over. This involves sort of the culture, I guess, of the Turks. That before the genocide, that it was something that simply happened every now and then. There would be a loud sound, a trumpet or a drum, and all in a normal day, and Turks would just start killing all the Christians there, and then that same sound would come again some hours later, and boom, everything would stop. So suddenly that even someone who had been injured by someone trying to kill them, that person would then help them up. I don't get it. Is there anyone that can explain that? That this is such a normal thing over hundreds of years that this is just, there's an etiquette of how to do it? There. That's it.
We'll give Mike, you had a question.
And the camera person is trying to ask.
Sorry, who is?
Yeah, with the smoke.
Oh, right.
It had to do with a quick question on identity, and it's, Tanner, if I understood your presentation, which I'd like to hear more of, it's how did this early part of the 20th, late 19th, early 20th century, progression from an Islamization demographic approach change into one that became increasingly ethno-nationalist. So you move from a process of Islamization of non-Muslim populations in the empire to one of a Turkification, which also had the religious element that took place. How did that come about and when?
Start with you, David.
Goodness. Let me see.
3 minutes too.
Right. Okay. The motivation for a Syrian pogrom and genocide, you mean why it is possible to categorize it as a genocide? Well, and I do this in a similarity to the Armenians. Were the Assyrians targeted for on the grounds of disloyalty? Yes. Just like the Armenians. Were they massacred? Yes. Were the massacres continual throughout the summer of 1915? Yes. Were their homelands emptied by the time the massacres were over? Yes, they were in other places. Was the killing organized with special task forces of local people dedicated just to removal and killing of the villagers? Yes. Was this done with the help of the local governor? Yes. Did the central government know about this? Yes. Did they encourage it? Yes. The local government, the governor of Diyarbakir was promoted to become the governor of Ankara after he had done these things. So it seems like we have a case of a very, very concerted but secret. And that's one of the reasons why it's not so known as the Armenian, because it just happened and quickly, which is the case with many genocides. So that's it. As to the difference between Nazis and Ottomans, in the Ottoman Empire, the bodies were lying all over the place. The Nazis certainly must have learned that you shouldn't do things so openly, would be one thing. But that's enough.
Okay, just to continue with this. In terms of the experiences of female victims and children's victims, it's different, Holocaust and the Armenian genocide. But in terms of the attention to reproduction, they are very similar. That's why both of them qualify for genocide. And this is how Raphael Lemkin
thought about them in the same breath, the person who coined the term genocide. The sexual violence that Jewish women experienced during the Holocaust was sterilization, for instance. The births among the target group were forcibly stopped. A lot of sterilizations and also forced abortions, for instance. Or in the camps, reproduction was forbidden. While the preferred Aryan races were not only encouraged, sometimes forced to reproduce a lot of children. So to change the balance, again, the demographic concerns are at the center of both cases. Another question about the success of the whole transfer policy. In the aftermath of the war, after the armistice of Mudros, October 1918, with which the Ottomans accepted defeat, Armenians and other Western organizations mostly were allowed to collect, locate first, then collect and retrieve and reintegrate these kidnapped women and children back into the Armenian community. So there's a process of re-Armenianization. That's how I started the whole project, actually. I was more interested to see what the Armenian Patriarchate, which is the main center that organizes these collection efforts, Vorpahavak, or rescue efforts, you can say, what they did with them, because who are you going to consider an Armenian? In the aftermath of this trauma, what is the eligible, who is going to be an Armenian? Would you accept a child born of rape who is fathered by a Muslim but is coming to life through an Armenian woman's body? Would you accept it as Armenian or not? So I looked at these administrative policies. The operations to bring the kidnapped Armenian back to the Armenian fold in contemporary Turkey's borders continue up until 1922-23. And during that time, we don't have one single number as to how many of them return, but it's not, I mean, I've heard 50,000 for some people, they are very random. No one have collected, please correct me.
1921 League of Nations has certain numbers.
Yes, they have certain numbers, but at the end, for instance, it also continued in Mandate era Arab countries, Syria being one of the majors, up until early 30s. Still, from Bedouin households, Christian women were collected and brought back to their original communities. So I don't have one big number. In terms of what we talk about today, the Islamized Turks who have one Islamized Armenian ancestor, the number that I see usually is 2 to 3 million people, correct me. This is what Hrant Dink talked about. This was the number that he gave. Yes. This is what Shoah Foundation gave. It's a major operation.
I mean, the numbers is always a problem for these orphanages and those women and girls who were taken in the Muslim households. We have estimates from 1921. This is the numbers of Armenian Patriarch in Istanbul and the League of Nations. They established a special committee for it, and their estimate is around, I mean, they took out of them 100,000 children and women and girls, and then their estimate was there were around 70 or 80,000 still in Muslim households. And we don't know whether these are really vague estimates. The question of the similarities and differences with Holocaust and what are the particular characteristics of the Armenian genocide, it depends on how you define the Holocaust, of course. If you define the Holocaust as a Jewish genocide, then there are a lot of differences, but if you approach Holocaust as a creation of a racial empire in Europe as a process of a racial empire, then the similarities increases. For example, the assimilation, forcibly taking out the children from households. These were German policies based on their racial policies. Against the Slavic people, they have the certain criteria developed. But What are the, if you compare with the Jewish case, the Holocaust, in the narrow term, there are 4 important differences. Number 1, forced conversion. It was structural element of Armenian genocide and was used throughout the genocidal process. There are fluctuations, I'm not going into detail, but you have to also know all those Armenians who convert to Muslim religion, they survived. So forced conversion, there was an up and down, I don't want to go into detail, but forced conversion was a structural element. Number 2, collection of the Armenian children and putting them in orphanages or distributing them in Muslim household. This is what Lerna spoke about. And the 3rd, forcible marriage of Armenian girls with Muslim men. This was also structurally planned, organized. And 4th, to your surprise maybe, there was a limited settlement policy. They indeed tried to resettle Armenians in Syria and Iraq for a certain period of time. But again, numbers. Beginning 1915 May, all the way 1915 end of November, there was a settlement policy. Armenians were resettled in Rasul, Raqqa, Resulayn, and Aleppo, and they also established special concentration camps throughout the Euphrates, and this policy were given up with the beginning of 1916, and a second wave of genocide was organized in the summer of 1916. Approximately 250,000 Armenians were massacred in the second wave. Why? Why then they settled Armenians at the first and then organized a second wave of killings? And this is a strong argument for genocide case, because Turkish government or any denialist would argue that the Ottoman authorities could not control the Kurdish mountains in Kurdistan, and this was the locals, but you cannot explain the mass atrocities and massacres and killing of more than 200,000 Armenians in Aleppo, Resulayn, Raqqa, and Deir Zor. These are the flat area under the control of Cemal Pasha, Third Army. Why? Numbers. They were getting regularly on weekly basis numbers of Armenian. My theory is, at the beginning, they thought they could really, only 10% Armenians could survive and they could be resettled in Syrian area. When they noticed, as a result of their demographic policy, that the numbers of Armenians increased and more than they expected, we know the Ottoman numbers, 1916 January, it is 500,000. It was too much. And then the second wave of cleansing and killing started. You know how many Armenians survived at the end? Approximately 150,000. Do you know the number of Muslims in the so-called resettlement areas? It's approximately 1.8 million. They really mathematically implemented a policy that at the end 10% survived, and these 10% were Muslims. They only survived because they forcibly assimilated, otherwise they could have sent to Deir Zor. So these Muslimized Armenians, 1918 October, reconverted to Christianity again. So for the Armenian friends, I have to tell them, if their parents survived the genocide, they were Muslims at least for 2.5 years. They couldn't have survived otherwise. The options were given to them, either Deir Zor or Islam, and they choose the Islam. So these are the settlement policy is the another important particularity of Armenian genocide, and because of the dominance of the Holocaust in our genocide field, we mostly ignore these particularities, and because in all cases, everybody who worked on their cases, they tried to push their cases as close as possible to Holocaust so that they could make their cases. But today, I think we are over this fledgling period, and we don't care much whether it resembles Holocaust or not.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you so much. Before we thank our brilliant panel, Fiona has a couple of words.
A very quick announcement. We've had a lot of food for thought here, but we're actually going to have real food in between. I know that this, is somewhat trivial in the context of some of the very heavy, weighty issues we've been discussing. But I do want to make sure that, you all know that the next session will actually begin at 12:45. So before we thank our panel, I would just like to let you know that there will be food served outside in the corridor here. My colleagues will show you where that is. And we look forward to seeing you all back here again. You can come in here and sit and eat if you'd like to. Obviously, we encourage people to have discussions. But we will start the next session again promptly at 12:45. But I'd like to hand over back to Tom to thank everybody for being here.
It's been a great discussion, and I think we should all thank our